before I forget, now I keep asking as we start this week, I keep asking, does anybody have a suggestion for where to go next after Genesis? Anybody had any thought about a book that you would like to hear? Um, or should we just keep going and go straight into Exodus? Exodus comes right on the heels of Genesis. Or do we want to go to a New Testament book? I'm going to go to First John on Sunday uh, when I get back from vacation. Now, for those that are listening and those here, we're not going to have Bible study the next 2 weeks. So the 14th and the 21st, no Bible study will be posted online. Faith, did you have an idea?
Well, if nobody else is going to make a suggestion, I think the little book of Ephesians is a good book to study.
I think so, okay.
Because it tells us who we are in Christ and what we need to do.
Okay, I think that's an excellent suggestion. And I really like to go Old Testament, New Testament. So we'll start on the book of Ephesians, and I'll be working on that as I travel and be ready. We've got a couple more chapters, a little more time in Genesis, and then we'll go into Ephesians after that. And then we'll.
Somebody else has a different suggestion. That's fine. I
Okay, well, I know you like to be a little bit pushy, so we'll take that into consideration as we as we do things. Okay, so we're in Genesis 47 for now, and this is where Jacob meets Pharaoh. Now, we're really, the story is kind of winding down, this adventure with Joseph and everything, and so a lot of things in Genesis 47 are making connections. Believe it or not, here in Genesis, we are tying back to things we've already heard, making connections backwards, and we're also making connections forward to things that are coming down the line, both things later in the Old Testament, later in the Pentateuch, and also things at the end of time. And so if we have time at the end, we're going to be looking at some of those things, how this Genesis 47 story ties to another prophecy in the Old Testament, which looks forward to the end of times and will remind us a little bit of Revelations if we get there today. So a lot of Genesis 47 is repeated material. Why does the author very frequently repeat things twice? Well, Joseph told us earlier, saying that when a prophecy was repeated twice, it shows that it is established by God, and thus it will occur. And so a lot of the reason, one, repetition is a way of telling stories in ancient times. It's just a technique that they use. But also, it is to tell us that this is not just because men said it, but God had established. It was predicted, and then it occurred.
It also tells us that it was important.
Right. It is for emphasis. This repetition shows that Joseph, in what he said, so he said a lot of these things in 46, now they happen in 47, that he is serving Yahweh's purposes. As it said back in Genesis 39, verse 2, Yahweh was with Joseph. This was the author telling us that Joseph was not just acting on his own steam, but God was working through him. So he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Now, this was way back when he was with Potiphar, and God was working with Joseph, so Joseph listened to God, Joseph obeyed God, Joseph used the wisdom of God, Joseph made choices that pleased God, and so God gave him success. And so a lot of the things that Joseph said would happen, he coached them to tell that they were shepherds so that the Egyptians would maybe help them, but want them to be shepherds far away from the big cities. So they got this very nice land of Goshen, this good land up in the delta, well-watered land. Also, we'll see Joseph's plan with the grain, selling grain to the people in chapter 47, and it will show that God was with him and what plans he made succeeded. So Joseph has saved the seed of Abraham from a severe and deadly famine in the land. Okay, that's where we're at now. Now, have you heard that before? Is that familiar stuff? Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brothers, their flocks and their herds, and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan, and indeed they are in the land of Goshen. He took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said in verse 3 to Joseph's brothers, what is your occupation? Now, Joseph has already coached them. He said, Pharaoh's going to want to know. You tell them that you're shepherds. They said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and also our father. And they said to Pharaoh, we have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks. For the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, please, let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. So they are petitioning Pharaoh for the plan that Joseph has set in motion. This is all part of working out the plan to get them to the good land in Goshen. Verse 5. Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is all before you. It's at your disposal. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. That word, the best of the land, is a variation of the word good. It's makov. And so tov is the word good, going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And God looked and he saw that it was good. Same word here, that your brothers dwell in the good land, in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know of any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my flock. So not only is he giving them good lands so that they could multiply and thrive, but he also is putting them over his livestock. And again, we are supposed to see how Joseph represents Israel. And the success that Joseph has had in Egypt is the success that the Israelites in general are going to have. Joseph is representative of Israel. And this same situation has happened already with Joseph. The brothers are repeating Joseph's own success in Egypt. If you remember back in Genesis 41:41, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. So in the same way that he elevated Joseph to a high position, now he's saying, not only can you have the good land, but I'm going to put you in charge of my herds, my herd animals, and be over them. This is fairly rare behavior for Pharaoh. If you think about Pharaoh in the Old Testament, do you normally think about him being really good to the Israelites? No. What we normally think of is Pharaoh cracking the whip, Pharaoh persecuting, Pharaoh killing babies, Pharaoh sending his army after the Israelites. Why is Pharaoh being magnanimous here? Why is he being good to the Israelites?
He was depending on Joseph.
He was depending on Joseph in the same way that God blessed Joseph. Now, not to diminish Joseph. Joseph was competent. Joseph was a great administrator. He was a wise man. But in the same way that God blessed Joseph so that men thought well of him, God is blessing the Israelites in general. And so Pharaoh, in spite of being Pharaoh, is being very good to the Israelites. John?
This is what you're discussing is before the Israelites became slaves.
Right, yes.
He was, Joseph was, his heir child or whatever.
Right.
And they weren't yet slaves. But it says, and I'm not sure where it is, I can let you know, because I don't have my Bible, I got to highlight this. And there arose a king in Joseph in Egypt would do not Joseph.
Right. And that's in Exodus 1. Yeah.
Bible.
Yeah.
But at this point in time, they were still a fair children.
Right. Right. And so this is all part of God's plan. Now, this is the way Genesis ends. Genesis ends with them in the good land. They are blessed. We'll see in a minute. They're fruitful and multiply in the good land. And so in the same way that Genesis began with God blessing mankind, man has fallen, man has run away, God has brought them back, and now he is putting them in a good land and favoring them. They are now having dominion over the herds and even over the Pharaoh's herds. Okay?
Pharaoh wasn't that good of a Pharaoh because he put the baker and the wine tester in prison because one of them makes spill a little bit of wine on his robe and the other one burned the biscuits. You know?
Right. So that's a good point. Pharaoh is acting out of character here. Why? Because God is at work in this. That's what we're supposed to see. Yeah, Joseph's good, sure. But there's other good men, that's got their head chopped off by Pharaoh. God is working things out. God is working things. And unfortunately, and it's a lesson for us too, unfortunately, part of God's plan is for things to turn against the Israelites. They still thrive. They still are blessed. However, Pharaoh makes it hard on them. Life is not easy. And see, that's the thing. We tend to only count the blessings when things are easy and when things make us wealthy. That's a blessing, and everything else is not a blessing. But the truth is, we all go through seasons like the Israelites where things are against us and life is hard. The true believer, the faithful person, can find blessing in those awful times if they rely on God. God can really, unfortunately, we probably grow in our faith more when we are under the gun and things are bad and we rely on God than we do in that really good season when things are going our way, bills are getting paid, everything's taking off. We tend to grow more when we are in bondage. Unfortunately. So, how is this happening? I've already said. Let's read on a little bit more. In verse 7, then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how old are you? Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Key phrase, we'll come back to it. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. They have not attained to the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. So my life's been a lot harder than Abraham's life, in other words, and Isaac's life. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh, it says it again, and went out from before Pharaoh. This is a little bit of a strange passage. Let's see if we can make some sense of it. First, that passage there ties this story, this little episode, back to God's promise to Abraham. He refers to the blessing of Abraham and the days of Abraham when he says the years of my father's pilgrimage. If you remember back, really, to me, this might be the central passage in the book of Genesis. Why did God call Abraham? This verse. I'm working a work in you, and I will bless those who bless you. Here, Pharaoh is blessing the Israelites. Israel, the man named Israel, former Jacob, now Israel, and he is getting a blessing. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh twice. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who treat you with contempt. And all the families of the earth, the Egyptians are all the families of the earth, will be blessed through you. So they are going to increase the wealth and prosperity and blessing of the Egyptians in their time there. This is God's plan. I'm working a work through the descendants of Abraham, in order to bless the whole world. And that's pointing to straight to the cross. I am making a blessing through the Jews, what will become the Jews. We're still Israelites now. Jews a long time from now. Lots going to happen. I'm going to bless the world with a descendant of Abraham, who is going to make connection with God, the true blessing, available to all people. Also, when he says, few and evil have been my years, we're like, do what? What does that mean? That's unexpected. Few and evil have been my days. I've had a rough life. Now let's just stop right there and ask ourselves, did God make Jacob's life rough?
He made it rough himself.
Jacob made bad choice after bad choice. He believed God, and then he hedged his bets too. So I believe you're going to rescue me, God, but I'm also going to, just in case you don't, I'm going to fix things. Jacob said, thank you for these children. I'm going to put them out in front in case they start killing people. These children will get killed first. And then I like these a little bit better, but not as much, so I'm going to put them second. These are my favorite child, so if he kills the first 10 children and wives and servants, then these will be, they'll have some time to run, but if they get those, at least he'll get them before he gets me. That's Jacob. God, protect us from the bad guys and kill my least favorite children first. That's Jacob. And that's a problem. So, this few and evil have been my years. That's a final commentary by the author. You know, I want to say we've been rough on Jacob. I think we've just called him out. We've called the truth. Jacob has made a lot of bad choices. And the author here is letting us know, putting the words, Jacob is recognizing that he has been a very mixed bag. This is a final commentary, negative on the life of Jacob. Jacob acquired his blessing from his father Isaac by deception. Now we talked a lot about this. Because of the power differential, it seems very clear to me in the narrative that Rebekah was doing right. Rebekah had no rights, and Rebekah could not just go, Isaac, you're doing wrong. Rebekah saved the day and got Jacob. But we saw in the very next story that he got his comeuppance when he went to see Laban, and Laban deceived the deceiver. And that's a way of telling us, in a storytelling way, justice is being served. Divine justice is coming back. The Asian people would call that karma. We say God is teaching Jacob a lesson. Also in that, Leah is the preferred wife, and the fourth child of Leah, is going to be the Savior. Now that's not to say the other children are not important, but that promised seed, that starting back in Genesis 3:15, the seed of the woman, that's going through Judah. So he acquired his blessing through deception, which was dishonoring the father. And we know, do not dishonor your father. And I will give you the note, Isaac was also in the wrong. Isaac was responsible. And that's a subtle sub-theme for parents, always. If Jacob is a deceiver, there's a problem with Isaac. And we see that in that story. In Deuteronomy 5:16, this is part of the law of Moses. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God commanded you. And if you do, if you honor your mother and father as God commanded you, then you will live long. What did Jacob say? Few and evil have been my days, the days of the years of my life. You will live a long, full life in the land that Yahweh your God has given you. And so clearly, Jacob did not honor his father. Few and evil have been my days. Okay?
There's two places in the Bible that promises us long life. That's one of them, and the other one is be kind to animals.
Be kind to animals. Be good to your daddy and mama, and be good to your dog. We'll boil the Bible down. That's a short version. There's a lot more to it, but that's the nuts and bolts. Contrast what Jacob did with what Abraham told to what with Abraham's life, the way it describes Abraham's life, and this was spoken to Isaac. This is back in Genesis 26. In Genesis 26, 3 through 6. God tells Isaac, live here, and he's in the land of Gerar on the coast where the Philistines were, near Abimelech. He says, live here as a foreigner in this land. I think Isaac is still considered in the land of Canaan. This is a foreign where foreigners are living. Live here as a foreigner in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. I will give all these lands to you. So right at that moment, it was a foreign land, but God makes a promise that that's going to be a part of the promised land, the land of Canaan. I will give you these lands to you and your seed, just as I solemnly promised Abraham your father. So he made the promise to Abraham that is fulfilled later with the land. I will cause your seed to become as numerous as the stars of the sky. Be fruitful and multiply, spread out and fill the land. You will realize, Isaac and your descendants, you will realize the blessing, the original blessing given in the garden to mankind. And through your seed, a repetition here of the promise made to Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Now, that's often translated. I changed the word to seed there because in Hebrew it is singular seed. It is in most of the English translations, King James, New King James, New American Standard, NIV, that's going to say descendants, plural. And that's a legitimate translation for the seed of a man is his descendants. I like the singular seed because I think it has a double meaning. I think, yes, it means the Israelites that come after you, your descendants. But I think it also means the seed, the one who is coming, will bless all nations. I will do this because Abraham listened to me and obeyed all my commandments. By contrast, Jacob says, few and evil have been my days. He has obeyed all my requirements, commands, decrees, and instructions. So that's the key, is obedience. Few and evil have been my days. I'm a mixed bag. I think Jacob represents all of us as sinful people. God does for Jacob what he does for all sinners who trust. I'm not sure what I was writing there. Trust, run to him in faith, turn to him, that's turn. Turn, who turn to him in faith. What he's doing for Jacob here in Egypt is what he does for all people who come to faith in God. Though Jacob must live out his remaining years and die outside of the land of promise, in the same way, when we come to faith in God, we spend the rest of our years here in this sinful, broken world. We are separated physically from God. We do not dwell in the land back in the garden together with him. Because of his own choices, he has ended up in a sort of exile, in a way. We are sort of exiled here the rest of our days on planet Earth. We still sin, people still sin to us and around us. However, God has made a provision for Jacob to preserve him, to survive, and his seed to survive, the seed of promise, and to bless them in a good land. We can dwell together with God here and now in this broken world. And it's a shade, an imperfect shadow of the glory that will be revealed to us. We can't believe the glory one day that we'll see. But we can get a glimmer when we are doing our work daily, when we are reading our Bible, when we are praying, when we are being kind to others, when we are speaking Jesus' name and testifying, when we are loving our family and loving our friends and acting in a loving way to strangers, we get a glimpse, momentary glimpse of the glory that we'll face. We have a life of purpose and significance. And that's what I think is happening to Jacob here. Yeah, he's in a good land. Yes, they're thriving and multiplying. They're being blessed. It's not quite in the land. And so I had that thought that this may be symbolic of us once we come to faith in God. We go on in verse 11. And Joseph situated his father and brothers and gave them possession in the land of Egypt in the best. Matov, you could translate that literally the goodest. The goodest of the land. In the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread according to the number in their families to get them started. So at that point, we're done with the brothers for a couple of chapters anyway. The story has kind of come to the end. We're still going to get blessings and curses later on, starting in chapter 49. But by and large, we're done with the big story of the 12 brothers, the sons of Jacob. This next little passage may seem secondary, but it is structured very similarly, believe it or not, to earlier stories of the brothers. And I'll try to mark out all those similarities as we go through. The little clues, the author just fills the story with little connections back and forwards so we don't forget to connect these stories. As we go through, I'll point these out. I'll try to highlight those. So that is famine in a land under famine. And we're going now into Joseph's leadership during the famine. Verse 13, meanwhile, the famine became so severe that all the food was used up. Is this the first famine that we faced in Genesis? This is what, about the fourth famine? So it's an old thing, connecting us back to Abraham in 12, to Abraham in chapter 20, to Isaac in chapter 26. The people were starving throughout the lands of Egypt and Canaan. So there's, again, a connection between Egypt, and the land of promise, the land of Canaan. That has recurred over and over. The people were starving. They were hungry. Verse 14, by selling grain to the people, Joseph eventually collected all the money, and in Hebrew it says all the silver, in Egypt and in Canaan, and he put the silver in Pharaoh's treasury. All right, again, that's alluding back to Joseph, Genesis 39:2, Joseph being, God was with him and blessed what he did. And so he was given this elevated position in Pharaoh. He ruled the country for Pharaoh. And this shows that Pharaoh picked right. He made Pharaoh more powerful than he ever was before. Verse 15, when the people of Egypt and Canaan ran out of money, all the Egyptians came to Joseph. Our money is gone, they cried. Please give us food or we will die. We've heard that over and over through Genesis, that we might live and not die. We will die before your very eyes. Jacob, if you remember, Jacob said this to his sons back in chapter 42:2. And he said, indeed, I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there that we may live and not die. So even internally in this one story, that is a reference back to this story, but it also references us back to the previous times there were famines. So this is the fourth big famine in the book of Genesis. Verse 16, Joseph replied, "Since your silver is gone, bring me your livestock. I will give you food in exchange for your livestock." So they brought their livestock to Joseph in exchange for food, in exchange for their horses, flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle and donkey. Joseph provided them with food for another year. He's just taken everything, all their money and all their livestock. Verse 18, but that year ended, and the next year they came again. All right? The next year or the second year is a phrase lifted right out of some previous stories again. They said to him, "We cannot hide the truth from you, O my Lord." And I put silver in there. It's translated money in New King James, but silver, because silver connects us back to a previous story. Our silver is gone, and all our livestock and cattle are yours. We have nothing left to give but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. Just give us the grain so we may live and not die. That same theme again. And so the land does not become empty and desolate. Going back to chapter 43, verses 1 and 2. Now the famine was severe in the land. This is back in the land of Canaan. And it came to pass, when they had eaten up the grain which they had bought. This is Jacob and the sons had bought grain the first time in Egypt and had gone back. They used it up and they came back. So internally, you see, internally in this story, the Egyptians are repeating what the Canaanite, or what the sons of Jacob had done. That their father said to them, "Go back and buy us a little more food in Egypt." Later in verse 8 it says, "Then Judah," beginning to take leadership and step forward, said to Israel his father, "We will arise and go, that" what? "We may live and not die." That theme again. Joseph said to his brothers in 45:5, "But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourself, because you sold me here into slavery." Again, same thing. The Egyptians have sold themselves into slavery to Joseph. In an ironic twist, Joseph had been sold to slavery to get him there. "For God sent me before you to preserve life." Again, repetition in these stories is for emphasis, but also to say there is a divine hand in these actions. God is working a plan through these events. Verse 20 of Genesis 47, so Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All Egyptians sold him their fields, because famine was so severe, and soon all the land belonged to Pharaoh. As for the people, he made them all slaves. Now, they are slaves of Pharaoh. We know the next story coming in Exodus, the Israelites will become slaves. So Joseph was sold into slavery. He rose to power. God blessed him. The Egyptians become slaves. He brings his brothers down. Then they become slaves. Then God lifts them up, and they are saved from slavery. From one end of Egypt to the other, the only land that did not buy was the land belonging to the priests, the Egyptian priests. They received an allotment of food directly from Pharaoh, so they didn't sell their land. Just that last sentence is interesting to me. There's a lot of parts of the Pentateuch. Scholars pick apart the Bible. Scholars will say there's no evidence that the Israelites were ever in Egypt. But this is an example of a detail in the text that a person not familiar with the ways of the Egyptians would not know. You see a lot of those in the whole Pentateuch. Faye, did you have a comment? So there's a flashback of Joseph going into slavery, back in chapter 37, verse 28. So the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by. Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them as a slave for 20 pieces of silver. So that's where that silver connects. They gave all their silver and made themselves slaves. Ironic reversal. And the traders took him to Egypt. Verse 23. So Joseph said to the people, look, today I've bought you in your land for Pharaoh. I will provide you with seed so that you can plant fields. I'm going to make you a good deal here. This is the first sharecropping. Then you will harvest it. 1/5 of your crop will belong to Pharaoh. That's not much, 20%. You may keep the remaining 4/5 as seed for your fields and as food for your household, for you and your households and your little ones. So Joseph is magnanimous. You have saved our lives. Okay? The big story in Exodus is God's salvation of the slaves in Egypt. And really, anyone who chooses to believe God is saved from Egypt. You know, there is a mixed multitude that goes out of Egypt with the Israelites. So it's not just Israelites that are saved. It is all who choose to believe God. There are 10 plagues, we call them. I think 9 warnings in a plague is probably more accurate. I think the way that it is intended, the numerology of those 10, 10 is the number for heavy emphasis. Times 10. Boom. No one can mistake in Egypt that this is the living God. There's 10 of these things. But the number 10 is 3 times 3, making 9, plus 1. 3 is the number for emphasis. God, in the first 9 plagues were warnings. There was 3 groups of 3. That's all the possible warning anybody could have. Still, their hearts were hard, and they refused, in spite of 3 times 3 warnings, to believe God. They preferred to trust what they already knew. They preferred to trust their man-made religion. They preferred to believe that Pharaoh could protect them, even though every one of the Egyptian deities, including Pharaoh, Pharaoh's job was to maintain ma'at, order. And so there were 3 times 3 warnings that Pharaoh has no power to keep God, that he's supposed to keep order. God makes disorder. God trumps Pharaoh, and the final plague, the taking of the firstborn son, is the taking of eternal life. If you reject God and refuse to believe him, then death without eternal life. That's what that symbolizes. The absolute rejection of God and his power, even though he's given you every possible warning. God's not being petty. He's not being peevish. At any point, Pharaoh can choose to believe God and give his heart to God, and it's over with, and we don't go to number 10. It's the same thing we believe about our own faith. We have this life. This life is 3 times 3 warnings. You better get it right. You don't know when number 10 is coming. Once number 10 comes, it's too late. But you have 3 times 3. John?
I was going to say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart.
Yes. And boy, John, you know what your favorite thing is? You bring a can opener every week, and you try to open a can of worms every week. Listen, Pharaoh, in all the cases, I have never seen a case in the Bible where it uses that phraseology, and people all want to say, oh, there's no free choice. I have never seen a choice where man was wanting to go right, and God hardened his heart and made him go left. What God does, a man wants to go right, and God hardens his heart so he doesn't get weak and stop. And so he keeps going. Pharaoh, God hardened his heart, but Pharaoh did what Pharaoh had wanted to do before God hardened his heart. Pharaoh was just weak. Go read the story. Pharaoh kept waffling. Pharaoh kept saying, okay, you can leave. No, you can't. You can leave. No, you can't. And God hardened his heart, so he stuck to it. But God did not change his mind. God, I think a much better phrase that I think matches what the text says is to say God hardened his resolve to stick to his guns. Because man waffles. God never waffles. There is no challenge in my mind to free will. I'll tell you what the challenge is to choose God over sin. That's what the problem is. Not man not having free choice. Man has free choice, we just pick sin. But it's a good question. Too big for today. But a good question. Yes, God, but the whole thing is a story of justice. That's my point here. And God does this to the mightiest people, the most educated people, the biggest army, most powerful army in the world, the best of everything in Egypt. He gave them 9 warnings and then a final judgment. And saved the people, and all that believed him left Egypt with the Israelites. It's the same hand that the world has been dealt, that we still believe the same basic thing. It's just now the Messiah has come to really open the door and make salvation for all people easy. And the same thing is going on in Egypt. But this is mirroring that. The Egyptians say to Joseph, you have saved our lives. God is the God of salvation. May it please you, my Lord, to let us be Pharaoh's servants. We are happy with this arrangement. We still have our breath. We can live as servants to Pharaoh. Joseph then issued a decree, still in effect in the land of Egypt, at the time this was written, that Pharaoh would receive 1/5 of all the crops grown on his land. Only the land belonging to the priests was not given to Pharaoh. Though Genesis ends in Egypt, okay, so we started in the Garden of Eden, we ended out of the land in Egypt, still, when we've already talked about God blessing them in Egypt, meanwhile, the people of Israel settled in the region of Goshen in Egypt, remember, a good land, just like the Garden of Eden was good. There they acquired property and they were fruitful and they multiplied. So this bookends. This be fruitful and multiply bookends the book of Genesis, and their population grew rapidly. Yahweh has blessed blessed them and saved them. Verse 28. Jacob lived for 17 years after his arrival in Egypt. So he lived 147 years in all. This does 2 things, this verse. Again, it ties us back to Jacob. Oh yeah, we just learned a lot about Joseph and how Pharaoh acquired all the people as slaves. And all the land became Pharaoh's. Then this verse ties us back to Jacob. Remember, we're talking about Jacob here. And the second thing it does is it jumps the story forward 17 years. So we see Joseph's plan and his power were well established. His plan worked. That is now the way that things are evermore in Egypt. Joseph was the one that made things the way they are throughout the Pharaoh's reign. Joseph's request now ties us back to the land of Canaan. In Genesis 47:29, as the time of his death grew near, Jacob called for his son Joseph and said to him, please do me this one favor. Put your hand under my thigh and swear that you will treat me with unfailing love by honoring this last request. Do not bury my bones in Egypt. Now that put your hand under my thigh takes us back to Abraham. In Genesis 24, he sent his servant to find Rebekah for Isaac as a wife. And he said to his servant, put your hand under my thigh and make the oath to me. What's the commonality here? He said, when I die, please take my body out of Egypt and bury me with my ancestors. In Hebrew it says, with my fathers, Abraham and Isaac. So Joseph promised, I will do as you ask. Swear that you will do it, Jacob insisted. Why is this so important to Jacob? Joseph gave him his oath, and Jacob bowed humbly at the head of his bed. That's the end of, well, almost the end of Jacob. There's a couple more little stories. So what's interesting is Joseph asked the same thing of his sons, that his bones be taken. And in fact, Joseph's bones are buried in Joshua 24:32 up at Shechem. You remember old Shechem? When they go up there and do the blessings and curses on the hills there, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And Joseph also has his bones buried in the land of promise. So why? Why do they do that? Well, there's a big theme, again, always big theme connections here. First, that it goes back to the promise of the land to Abraham, the centrality of that the land of Israel. The biggest paper in Israel today is called Haaretz, and that means in Hebrew, the land. That is central. That is the land that God gave them. There's a connection between mankind and the land. And this is the land that God gave them. And when they are in the land, they are connected with God. In the garden, they walked with God. There was no sin. And so that is a big, big theme. And it's important to Jacob, and it's important then to Joseph also. Burying the bones in the land of promise demonstrates faith in God's promises. You believe God. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We were formed from the land by God. He breathed his breath into us. We believe God. We trust him for our eternal life. We want our physical dust, bones to be buried in the ground where we walk with God. We rest in the land, and we spend our eternity with Yahweh. It is a key symbol to the Israelites of their faith in God and their hope in God. And we see it again in Ezekiel, going all the way to Ezekiel. Now what's interesting, do you know where Ezekiel is when he has this dream and makes this prophecy? He's in Babylon. He's in captivity. Again, because of their apostasy, they've been taken away from the land. But God gives Ezekiel this dream and prophecy. O my people, I will open your graves of exile here in the land of Babylon, and I will cause you to rise again. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. When this happens, O my people, you will know that I am Yahweh. I will put my spirit in you, my Holy Spirit. You will live again and return home to your own land. Then you will know that I, Yahweh, have spoken, and I have done what I said. Yes, the Lord Yahweh has spoken. And he's talking about them bones, them dry bones, and the flesh coming back on them. Faye?
The story of them bones and dry bones tells us that Israel is going to come back gradually. Not at one time, they'll come back gradually.
Okay. But that is, again, this connection of burying the bones and God bringing them back together. And so it is, we believe, bury my bones in the land, because God is calling us home. One further connection to Ezekiel 37. A little bit later, verses 21 through 24, I will gather all the people of Israel. Now, this is written by Ezekiel. The Israelites, the northern kingdom of Israel, after Solomon is split into the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. They fought wars. You know, they were two separate nations. Assyria has long since, hundreds of years before this prophecy, had taken the Israelites, the northern kingdom, away. And they've disappeared from human history at that point. They have mixed. And there's no people from those people that still call themselves Israelites. They've become, wherever they were taken, they've disappeared from human history. But God knows where they are. Jeremiah prophesied of them coming back. Ezekiel prophesied right here that they will come back. I will gather all the people of Israel from among the nations. I will bring them home to their own land from the places where they have been scattered. Now let me give you one other thing. It doesn't jump out in this text. Joseph comes to represent the northern kingdom of Israel. That is Joseph's descendants. They're often called Ephraim. That northern kingdom are called Ephraimites, the descendants of Joseph. Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay?
Isn't it in the book of James that he wrote the 10 tribes of Israel?
I'm not calling that in my mind, but you're probably right.
I think James wrote
Yeah.
the 10 tribes of Israel.
This is what the 10 tribes are, the northern kingdom of Israel. And they represent Joseph. Judah represents Judah, the tribe of Judah. And of course, modern we call them Jews. That's just a contraction of a Judahite, Judah. From all the places they have been scattered, I will unify them, that is Israel and Judah, Joseph and Judah, into one nation. On mountains of Israel, one king will rule them all. Who do you reckon that is? No longer will they be divided into two nations. They will never again pollute themselves with their idols and vile images and rebellion. Why are they in exile? Because they turned their back on God. They began to think that the stuff of the people around them, they like their possessions, they like their religious system, they like what their philosophies were, and they lost their holiness. They lost their uniqueness. Could you tell them apart? No, we're just fitting in. He said, no longer will you have your idols, your vile images, and rebellion, for I will save them from sinful apostasy. I will cleanse them, purify them, make them holy. They will be truly my people, and I will be their God. My servant David will be their king. David has been dead at this point for 500 years. So what's he talking about? Is he saying that David will come back, be resurrected? Or are we talking about a descendant of David? We are still tracking the seed. Here is Joseph and Judah from Genesis 47 and so forth, coming back together at the end of time under a descendant of David. My servant David will be their king, and they will have only one shepherd. What did Jesus say? I am the good shepherd. That's good. That's a pretty amazing thing. And I think that's where we're going to end today. Any questions or comments on that? But all that ties together. You see Genesis, the story of Joseph and Judah. Here, this is probably over 1,000 years later after those events in Egypt. Ezekiel makes this prophecy for a future time that I don't think we've seen yet. We may have, as Faith said, this is going to be a gradual thing. We've already seen a recollection of the children of Israel in our day. I think in everybody here except me's lifetime, God began recollecting a nation in where? The land And he's starting a process. I don't know how long it's going to take, but one day he will collect them all under a descendant of David, one shepherd. I think that's good stuff. That's why I like to study the Old Testament, because the Old Testament and New Testament are one canon, one truth that goes together. Any other thoughts? All right. Let's say a prayer and be dismissed.